Hi, this is Paula Gloria welcoming you to Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Today, Webster and I are going to do something special. We're going to do a slideshow presentation about whether people knew about Pearl Harbor happening beforehand. But in order to do this, this is going to be two shows because Webster needs to set the stage. So Webster, welcome to Farther Down the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you, Paula Gloria.
How do you want to proceed? Because we've got the PowerPoint up here.
Okay, let's try answering your question first of all. The problem of Pearl Harbor is, of course, the accusation made by really many these days that somehow there's a conspiracy around Pearl Harbor, and that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, is somehow the main party to that conspiracy, and that therefore the Japanese attack is an example of LIHOP, letting something happen on purpose for your own strategic gain. And this vocabulary, of course, comes out of the 9/11 question. What I would assert is, yes, there is a conspiracy. Yes, there are conspirators who know in advance that the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. However, Roosevelt, according to my information, is not part of the conspiracy. Roosevelt is really the target of the conspiracy. The principal conspirators are Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and a great hater of the United States all his life, as we can show, a group of Anglophile naval officers, that is, a group of United States Navy admirals in Washington and elsewhere, who are loyal not to their own country, not to the Constitution or the U.S. chain of command. They're loyal to the British Empire agenda. They are Anglophiles. They are, in that sense, agents of influence. I would also point especially to Colonel Henry Stimson, who is at this point the Secretary of War, the then equivalent to the Secretary of Defense, and to his principal military aide, the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. The background for this entire question is simply the very basic methodological point that in the oligarchical system of the United States after the 1890s in particular, you cannot assume that just because somebody is president of the United States, that everything that happens in the federal bureaucracy is somehow something that they do or order or in on. Right? This idea has been, I think, discredited. Some people have come forward saying Lyndon B. Johnson is the one who organized the Kennedy assassination. Absurd. Or George Bush organized every detail of 9/11. Equally absurd. George Bush, of course, becomes the spokesman for the 9/11 coup, but he is obviously, as a moron and somebody with no particular power, is not told in advance of most of the details, and certainly is not organizing them. Really, neither is Cheney, although Cheney is at a somewhat higher level. So you've got to start from this idea of the invisible government. Now we're looking at Franklin D. Roosevelt. The important thing to see here is that Roosevelt has extremely powerful enemies. Since about the 1890s, you've got this invisible government. You've got people like J.P. Morgan. You've got Andrew Mellon, that we're going to see in just a minute, but I'll tell you when to move the slides. You've got Elihu Root. As I say, Colonel Stimson is part of this. Colonel Stimson is a very interesting example. He's George Bush the Elder's ego ideal. He's the guy who gave the graduation commencement address at Andover in 1942, I guess it is, when Bush the Elder graduated from prep school. So this is a group of people inside the U.S., and of course they're the financiers, they're the Wall Street group, but they really conceive of themselves as a kind of an extension of the City of London and British high finance. And I think it's here that you're going to be seeing the main questions about Pearl Harbor. Now let's move the slides to Sir Winston Churchill. He, of course, is the darling and hero of the neocons. They regard him as a paragon. His entire life is animated by hatred of the United States, perhaps mediated through the fact that his mother was American, right? And maybe he hates his mother. This would remain to be explored by psychiatrists. But he is, of course, the person who, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, pegs the pound at about 20% too high compared to gold. The machinations that are undertaken to defend that irresponsible and reckless decision are the cause of the crash of 1929. which he then witnessed in person. He is somebody who, as we're going to see, is absolutely devoted to continuing British world naval supremacy at all costs. And this is one of the biggest background factors. The British, since Trafalgar, since their victory over the combined Napoleonic French and Spanish fleets in 1805 until the 1930s and 1940s, exercised total world naval domination. And I guess the roots of Pearl Harbor really start in World War I, when the United States passes a naval bill in 1916, which calls for immediately building 10 new battleships and 10 battle cruisers. Those are what are called capital ships. Those are the strategic weapons of the time, comparable to intercontinental ballistic missiles in our own day. The United States then enters World War I on the side of the British, an act of tremendous folly, as we'll see, and is not able to, for various reasons, because of sabotage inside the Woodrow Wilson regime and other things, does not build the 16 capital ships. Those 16 battleships would have given the United States at least equality with the British, and by some measures would have meant that the United States had pulled ahead to become the #1 naval power in the world. Now, these tensions really explode after World War I is over. They explode at the Peace Conference of Versailles, right? That's the one that's often called a peace to end all peace.
A peace to end all war.
A
peace to end all war.
No, a peace to end all peace. It's a peace that guarantees there's going to be a new war. That's the title of a book about the Middle East.
Oh.
A peace to end all peace.
Wow.
After Versailles, there's going to be nothing but war. And that's exactly what happens. Now, in November 1918, Sir Winston Churchill, the great hater of the United States, addresses this problem. Will the United States pass the British and become the dominant naval power of the world? And he says, I won't try to imitate his actor accent, his bombastic, histrionic delivery, but Churchill says, nothing in the world, nothing that you may think of or dream of or anyone may tell you, no arguments, however specious, no appeals, however seductive, must lead you to abandon that naval supremacy on which the life of our country depends. Now, that is a hard-line, absolute British naval superiority position, and what he's really talking about is a possible war with the United States. Now, as I pointed out, Paula, the reason that you've got to spend a whole program before you get to Pearl Harbor is that most people have absolutely no idea of the world situation of the 1920s and the 1930s, because it is in the interest of the British to suppress all knowledge of these things. Here's a memo from the United States Navy to President Woodrow Wilson in April 1919. Every commercial rival of the British Empire has eventually found itself at war with Great Britain and has been defeated. We in the United States are now becoming the greatest commercial rival of the British on the sea. Get the idea? A war is absolutely possible. At Versailles, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George tells Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, Great Britain will spend her last guinea, her last pound, to keep a navy superior to that of the United States or any other power. So this is now the central issue strategically in the 1930s and 20s. Let's go to the next slide. This is Admiral William Benson. He is an American patriot. He is anti-British. He is the chief of naval operations for the United States during World War I. It's interesting that he happens to be a Roman Catholic with strong ties to the Vatican, and I guess that's one of the bases for his skepticism about the British. This guy, Benson, at Versailles, tells the British delegation, he says, if you persist in your demand for absolute world naval supremacy, I can assure you this will mean only one thing, and that is war between Great Britain and the United States. War between Great Britain and the United States. And that is the dominant international tension of the 1920s. Remember the British strategic formula, geopolitics and divide and conquer. What is it? It basically says if the British are #1, they ally with #3 against #2. Okay? In the World War I period, you can say, at least in naval terms, the British are number one, the Germans are number two, the U.S. is number three. So the British ally with the U.S., number three, against the German number two, and wipe them out. But what happens when the German fleet is destroyed, as it is during World War I and then later on at Scapa Flow? At that point, the United States becomes number two. Who is number three? Number three is Japan. So the British policy in World War I, and especially in the 1920s, is the British ally with Japan against the United States. Now, people find this unbelievable. Remember, the British alliance with Japan goes back to 1903. Remember the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The Japanese attacked Russia. They do that as an asset and a marcher lord and a long tentacle of the British, because the British are interested in busting up the Russian Empire. During World War I, the Japanese are allied with the British. Remember, people think, oh, the Japanese and the Germans were always together. Not in World War I. In World War I, it was the Japanese on the side of the British against the Germans, and indeed capturing all those little islands. You know, the Marianas and the Carolines and the Marshall Islands, all those places where the U.S. had to do these tremendously costly naval assaults during the World War II. Those islands were given to Japan at Versailles by the British, under British influence, and this is what causes the big strategic problem of the United States during World War II. For example, the Marshall Islands are right across the supply line from the U.S. to the Philippines. Right, if you look at your map. So there's always this undertone that the British and the Japanese are colluding. And again, most people who look at Pearl Harbor have no idea of this. Admiral Benson is somebody who says to the British at one point, he says, I don't understand why we're fighting the Germans. We might as well be fighting the British. Let's fight the British, says Admiral Benson. That was the patriotic U.S. point of view, and it was indeed the traditional one, the whole 19th century, especially, the War of 1812, the Civil War. The British were seen as the main sponsors of the Confederacy, and so forth. So this is one faction. There's a patriotic faction in the U.S. Navy around this guy Benson. Now let's go to the next slide. This is somebody else, Admiral William Sims. He's the Anglophile. He loves the British. He thinks the United States should be an annex of Great Britain. And what he does during World War I, during World War I, the United States, of course, has a pretty considerable Navy, number 3 in the world, I guess, at that point. And he takes all the U.S. battleships and he takes them over to Britain, and they become the American battle squadron of the British Grand Fleet. So he accepts not to have an independent command, but to just be, a part of this British battleship division. Now, this guy represents Wall Street and the invisible government. Let's just take the next slide to see how interesting this is. This is Time magazine, right? 1921. So this is the magazine of Skull and Bones, Henry Luce, the invisible government, right? Time magazine, very strongly under Henry Luce at that point, just coming out. And look, they have 3 pictures of Admiral Sims, the pro-British admiral. He's a Renaissance man. Oh, he's so wonderful. He can be he can walk around like a country gentleman on the left, and in the middle there he is in his admiral's uniform, but he's also a great catcher for the local baseball team. So they obviously had political ambitions for this guy. Sims is the centerpiece of a pro-British faction in the U.S. Navy. They love the British. They want to serve the British in every way. This has to do, of course, with ideas of social status and so forth. Now, let's just also, skipping to the next slide, Andrew Mellon. The idea here is simply to give you an idea of the invisible government presence. This guy, Andrew Mellon, is the Secretary of the Treasury all during the 1920s, under Harding, under Coolidge, under Hoover. It is said correctly, those 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, worked under Andrew Mellon. Under. This is an example of the invisible government operative in the government being more powerful than the grinning, shuffling elected president who's got to go out and glad hand and kiss babies and run for office and do the whistle stops and all this other stuff. This is Mellon. So the faction, I guess we can say, is Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller, and others. And again, that's the New York branch of the City of London. And it just shows the tremendous power of the British agenda in this. Now let's go to the next slide, which is the one I'd like to keep up for the rest of the show. So Winston Churchill with a machine gun, a gangster. This absolutely captures what he represents with his Thompson submachine gun. Let's look at this now. There is a war scare between the United States and the British in 1920 to 1921, as I've just been describing. And at this point, the nationalists in the United States say, we're going to build the world's biggest navy. And the British say, no, you're not. We'll hit you with a preventive attack if you do. This is what's going on behind the scenes. And you can see it reflected in Foreign Office memoranda. I could submerge you in quotes from my research on this stuff. Anyway, one of the main other invisible government guys in the Harding regime is Charles Evans Hughes. He's the Secretary of State. He later goes on to become one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, one of the reactionaries in the Supreme Court who tries to stop Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. So he's going to be a Roosevelt hater later on. But what Charles Evans Hughes does is he says, oh, we can't have a battle between the United States and the British. What we've got to do is have a disarmament conference. So in November 1921, he brings in the Washington Naval Conference. Absolutely forgotten today. Most history professors have never heard of it. And what they come up with is a formula that goes like this. It says the United States and the British can have fleets that are equal in battleships, because this is considered to be the main thing. The Japanese get slightly less, and the French and the Italians get about half of what the Japanese get. And the formula is a famous one, 5 to 5 to 3 to 1.67 to 1.67. The 5 is the British, the 5 is the U.S., the 3 is Japan, the 1 2/3 approximately is the French, and the 1 2/3 is the Italians. Now that basically solves this question, but the main sacrifices made by the United States in giving up these ships. The United States is the only country that actually has to wreck ships that are already being built. Everybody else gives up ships that they might build. So the U.S. sacrifices real steel keels, and everybody else sacrifices hypothetical ships. Now this is not enough. There's another crisis later on in the 1920s, around 1926, 27, 28. There's a crisis this time not about battleships, because that's been taken care of, but cruisers, light cruisers, heavy cruisers, like these ships of 4,000, 5,000 tons, 10,000 tons, with sort of medium armament. There's a conference in 1927 sponsored by Calvin Coolidge. It blows up. Then Herbert Hoover comes in. He decides to make a deal with the British at Rapidan, Virginia, and we get the London Naval Treaty of 1930. All of this stuff absolutely forgotten. I would just say in passing, look at some of these presidents. Not all of them are total servants of the invisible government. Remember, William McKinley was not so happy about the Spanish-American War, didn't really want to take the Philippines. He's assassinated. So Madman Theodore Roosevelt can come in and become president. In the case of Warren G. Harding, he's one of the most slandered presidents, right? He's corrupt, he's got mistresses, he plays cards, he drinks, and of course you have this tremendous Teapot Dome scandal. As far as I can see, Harding is somebody, he says, he wants to have world naval equality with the British and perhaps even world naval supremacy. Right? That's Harding. He says we have to have a navy equal to our aspirations, and we are the most eminent of the maritime nations. Sounds like he wants the biggest fleet. And how does he die? Oh, he made the mistake of taking a trip to Canada, to Vancouver, got very sick on his trip to Vancouver, came back and died. And the person who ran the big scandals against him is none other than Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who is in the Navy Department. That's the Teapot Dome scandal. Okay, so the result of this is, remember, theoretically it's supposed to be 5 to 5 to 3 to 1.67 to 1.67. In reality, the other countries all cheat. So what you get out of this is not the treaty formula, but rather something like this. The British end up with 5, say in this proportion, battleships. The U.S. 3.73, the Japanese 3.31, the French 1.89, and the Italians 1.5. So the Italians are about observing the treaty. But notice, the big thing to look at is the relation between the U.S. and the Japanese. The U.S. 3.73, the Japanese 3.31. That is the ratio that makes Pearl Harbor possible. In other words, you might say, how could the Japanese imagine that they could attack a country several times their size with so much more steel, so much more shipbuilding, so many more ships, although they're split between the Atlantic and the Pacific? The reason is that the British have been able to prevent the U.S. from building the ships that were ordered in 1916 that would have established a two-ocean navy capable of defending itself. It's a very good example of how so-called well-meaning disarmament treaties, or some of the people, the dupes who go along with it, are well-meaning, how those disarmament treaties lead directly to war. So it means that over in the 1920s and the 1930s, the entire U.S. naval program is strangled, it's handcuffed by this Washington Naval Conference. It's called the Treaty Navy. Again, none of this is ever taught in any high school. The person who begins rebuilding the U.S. Navy is, of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it's a jobs program in 1933, and it's a naval program. Roosevelt comes in, he says, forget this stuff, forget the Washington Naval Conference. I want 7 battleships and 3 carriers immediately. And that is without that, the World War II situation would have been absolutely grim. Now, let's also look at a couple of other things. Concerning battleships as a strategic weapon, see, it's clear by the time you get to Pearl Harbor that the main strategic weapon is no longer a battleship. It's an aircraft carrier, and to some extent a land-based bomber, right, an airplane. And the issue here is, inside the U.S. Navy, you have a mass of people, and they tend to be the same ones, who are pro-British, and they don't like air power. They think that the battleship is going to rule the world well into the end of the 20th century. These are battleship admirals. Now, we had this question. General Billy Mitchell of the Army, right, Army Air Force, in the 1920s, shows that it's easy even for the airplanes of the time, which are not very formidable, right? These are biplane bombers with 2 wings, right, one over the other. They can sink the unsinkable German battleship Ostfriesland off the Virginia Capes. And they prove it. They say, look, these battleships are going to get destroyed with airplanes. But the battleship admirals say, no, they're hysterical. They mobilize the entire thing because they want you to think that the battleship is the main thing, because they want public money for battleships. This also fits the British interest, because the British by now have this huge investment in battleships, right? At the Battle of Jutland in 1916, between the German and British fleets, the British steam out with, 25, 28 dreadnought battleships and some sort of super dreadnought fast battleships. So there's a lot of backward thinking in the Navy. When you look at Admiral Kimmel, jumping a little bit ahead, we're going to show you his picture in the next program. When you get to Admiral Kimmel, who's commanding the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941, this is obviously somebody whose heart is with the battleship. He's the former commander of the battleship New York, and you can see the way he writes his dispatches that what he thinks he's going to do when war breaks out between the United States and Japan is that he's going to go out and he's going to refight the Battle of Jutland, 1916. And the airplane is really just a scout plane, right? It's going to help the battleships to shoot better and maybe find where the enemy is. So, all of this stuff, let's just, we have a couple of minutes, maybe just 1 or 2 little more things about the British hostility to the U.S., because people have a hard time with this. Let's go into the folly of the United States. How about this? Why the United States was so foolish to give up naval supremacy for a piece of paper at the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922. Here's a writer of the time, H.M. Robinson. He says, the Washington Naval Conference was one of the costliest bits of diplomatic blundering that ever befell the United States. It was a comic script with the United States cast as the première stripteaseuse, the stripper, a peace-loving loving but weak-minded creature who could always draw enthusiastic applause by wantonly denuding herself in the presence of her enemies, right? Giving up all those battleships makes no sense. The other thing I guess I should add is that in terms of the war plans of the United States, I'm actually the person who brought this to light. There's something called War Plan Red, and it's very active all during the 1920s and 1930s. It is a plan for a war between the United States and the British Empire, because that was the most likely war at the time. Any air defense built by the United States during the 1920s and 1930s was a defense against what? It was a defense against the Royal Air Force operating from Canada. And when you see that there's, for example, there used to be a U.S. air base at Plattsburgh, New York. What's the point of having an air base at Plattsburgh, New York? Well, everything, because that's where the British Royal Air Force is going to be coming from to bomb you. So there's War Plan Orange for Japan, War Plan Black for Germany, War Plan Green for Mexico. War Plan Red is Japan. I put this stuff out in the mid-1990s. There has been recently, you can look it up on the Google, Washington Post did an article on War Plan Red, as if they had just discovered it. But I had brought it to light many years. And you look on the internet, if you do War Plan Red in quotes and Tarpley, you'll probably find one of my essays on that scattered all over the place. Well, what's this? Basically says, if there's a war between the United States and Great Britain, you got to capture Halifax, Nova Scotia. That would be the main British sea base. You've got to make a thrust north from Plattsburgh towards Montreal and Quebec eventually. You've got to make an attack from Buffalo to take over the Welland Canal and defend the Niagara area. From Detroit, you've got to go across into Canada. From Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, you've got to go across into Canada and protect the Sioux Canal, this absolutely critical lifeline between Lake Superior and the rest of the Great Lakes, where all the iron ore and stuff goes through. Make a thrust north to Lake Winnipeg to cut the Trans-Canada Railway. And above all, make sure you capture Vancouver, British Columbia, because that is where the Indian troops of the British Empire would be coming to kill you, and the Japanese forces that would likely be allied with the British. And the War Plan Red generally assumes that the British are going to be working hand in glove with the Japanese. Another thing it says is, go and capture British Honduras, Belize. Belize today is one of the main drug points for shipping drugs into the United States. So this is simply the reality, and any other history that ignores all this stuff is impossible. And I think now that we've talked about the U.S.-British hostility, the two brushes with war...
Webster, we're out of time. I can hardly wait for part 2, okay?
We'll get to Pearl Harbor in the next broadcast.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. This is Paula Gloria with Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Stay tuned for part 2. I actually ran over on